just so that you're aware of that. If you've got any comments or questions as we go through, if you'd like to put them in the chat, then we will pick those up as we at the appropriate time. And otherwise, we will kick off. I'm delighted to have Michael Preston-Shoot with us, who's Professor Emeritus, I can never say that word, of social work at the University of Bedfordshire. And he's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He's held various social work academic positions for many years, and also editor of several social work journals. And he's had a number of publications and research that's concentrated on law and social work practice, particularly around adult safeguarding. So we're delighted to have Michael with us, and he's going to take us through now, and I'll let him crack on because there's some fabulous stuff.
Great, thank you ever so much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for making time out of your busy diaries to reflect on adult safeguarding and homelessness. The slides are drawn from two briefings which are published on the Local Government Association website on the adult safeguarding pages of the LGA website, and the references for them are at the end of the slides. By all means, use the slides and the handout version of the slides if you find them at all useful. I'm more than happy for them to be used. What I'm going to run through, and it will be something like a 100-metre sprint rather than a slightly longer race. I'm going to run through the evidence base, what we know about best practice for working with people experiencing homelessness with a particular lens on adult safeguarding. And the evidence base, as you can see from this slide, is drawn from the voices of people with lived experience, safeguarding adult reviews, research evidence, and what practitioners and managers, both strategic and operational, across health, housing and social care have told me and others. So that's where the evidence base is drawn from. Next slide, please, Karen. So starting with the voices of lived experience in line with making safeguarding personal, a number of safeguarding adult reviews, and three of them are mentioned here, actually present the voices of people with lived experience. And I think it's important to start with that. One SAR that has recently been published, that was published after I did these slides, I would strongly recommend to you. It's published by Kirklees Safeguarding Adult Board. It's known as Adult N. And the reason I'm recommending this to you is because the sister of Adult N, who died as a result of alcohol dependence and homelessness and self-neglect, his sister shared with me a poem that Adult N had written about his experience of being alcohol dependent, and his prediction that dependence would ultimately kill him, which is indeed what it did. And it's a very powerful personal expression of how one individual viewed their relationship with alcohol and alcohol's relationship with them. Next slide, please, Karen. And the reason for starting with voices of lived experience is that they remind us to see the whole person and not just individual aspects of whatever problems are presented to us, either in primary care, emergency departments or elsewhere. They remind us of the importance of understanding a person's journey, and particularly those aspects of a person's journey that might have included different forms of trauma, and to recognise that very often behaviours that to us might appear unwise are indeed attempted solutions by individuals to protect themselves from the distress and the pain of adverse experiences. And if you read the Adult N SAR from on the Kirklees Safeguarding Adult Board website, you will see there that Adult N had experienced a number of adverse events, particularly in adulthood, that had really propelled him into alcohol abuse. So it's an important reminder that if we are attempting to address the presenting problems, we should also attempt to address the underlying causes. Next slide, please, Karen. And what we can glean from listening to the narratives, the stories of people with lived experience, is that they have clear ideas about what is helpful for them and what is not helpful for them. And as I work through the presentation, you will see considerable synergy between how people with lived experience feed back to us their experiences of what works and what doesn't work in terms of how we seek to engage with them. Considerable synergy between that and the learning from Safeguarding Adult Reviews and the learning from research and for the voices of practitioners and managers. So here you have got a slide where people with lived experience have talked about direct practice, what I would call direct practice. So the importance of professional curiosity, the importance of partnership working, the importance of being person-centered, and the importance of being careful about the assumptions that we might otherwise make, the prejudgments that we might otherwise make about people who are alcohol dependent, dependent on other drugs, self-neglecting, homeless, and so forth. Next slide, please, Karen. They also comment about how services do or don't work together. So they highlight the importance of collaboration between services rather than silo working. And they talk about the importance of explaining what adult safeguarding is, because they might well be thinking that adult safeguarding is similar to or identical to children's safeguarding, and in some respects it might be, but in other respects it's crucially different. So not to assume that people understand what we're talking about when we use the word safeguarding. Next slide, please, Karen. And they also talk about how they think organisations can best support the different members of the team around the person. So they talk about being involved in commissioning. They talk about and recognise the importance of supervision and staff support and managerial oversight of cases which are particularly complex or challenging. They recognise, in other words, the impact of the work on us and advise that we need to pay close attention to the impact of the work on us. And I've recently been involved in a couple of cases which you can find on the Salford Safeguarding Adult Board website, SARs known as ERIC and CANU, spelt K-A-N-N-U. GPs and members of primary care teams were closely involved in trying to support ERIC and CANU, and the impact of that work had a substantial emotional impact on the general practitioners and members of the primary care team involved. And to some degree, they were perhaps not supported as much as you or I would like. Next slide, please, Karen. And people with lived experience also talk about governance and the need for us to be clear that adult safeguarding sits with Safeguarding Adult Boards, but where does homelessness sit? Does it sit with Safeguarding Adult Boards, community safety partnerships, health and wellbeing boards, homelessness reduction boards? Where does it sit? and being clear about that, being clear about the importance of offering multi-agency training in order to raise people's awareness of the evidence base for working with adults experiencing homelessness. And they also talk about the national context within which all of our work is situated. And don't we know that at the moment as a result of the pandemic and the Everybody In initiative in the first lockdown, designed to get people living street-based lives off the streets quite successfully, as it happened, and into hotels and other forms of accommodation prior to moving them on to more hopefully permanent accommodation. Next slide, please, Karen. So having started and rushed through to a degree the voices of people with lived experience, the importance of some definitions. Safeguarding adult reviews increasingly talk about multiple exclusion homelessness, and so do researchers. And that is to recognise that homelessness is often accompanied by other forms of adverse experiences, both in childhood and in adulthood, and that it is important to have a trauma-aware, trauma-informed approach. And I know that many health professionals and the organisations that they work for are developing or have developed a trauma-informed, trauma-aware approach in relation to the individuals with whom they are working. So the idea of multiple exclusion homelessness recognises that simply to tackle homelessness on its own is insufficient. One also has to think about wraparound support to address physical health issues, mental health issues, learning disability issues where present, and so on. Next slide, please, Karen. And it's also important that one understands care and support needs and the definition of care and support needs, because that is what governs the work of adult social care and adult safeguarding. So there is a definition of at least the origin of care and support needs, which you can see identified in the uppermost bullet point on that particular slide. It gives you some further information about the importance of adult social care, working with housing departments, but also other services, particularly health services. And it reminds us all that there are human rights issues here, particularly in respect to people with no recourse to public funds. And you may find yourselves having to remind adult social care departments that when they are undertaking assessments, particularly but not just in relation to people with no recourse to public funds, they should be factoring in to those assessments a person's right to life and a person's right to live free of inhuman and degrading treatment, Articles 2 and 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Next slide, please. So if one element of the evidence base is made up of the voices of lived experience, the next part of the evidence base is made up of safeguarding adult reviews. On the Local Government Association website, you will find a research report of the first ever national analysis of safeguarding adult reviews, which covered all reviews published between April 2017 and March 2019. There were 231 reviews in the sample, 25 of which contained references to homelessness, 57 contained references to alcohol abuse. I can tell you that 161 contained references to mental distress of varying forms. On we go. And in relation to homelessness, which is the focus for today, this slide identifies where you can find some safeguarding adult reviews that have focused on individuals experiencing homelessness. And the next slide gives you, if someone can go on mute, because I don't particularly want to overhear a telephone conversation. Thank you. And here are some other reviews that are recent, and you can see the Kirklees review is mentioned there. There are some thematic reviews which look at more than one case in a particular area of people experiencing homelessness. So we have, from Safeguarding Adult Reviews, a substantial evidence base about best practice. Next slide. And in short order summary, particularly from the National SAR analysis, you can see where Safeguarding Adult Reviews were referencing good practice. You can see where they were referencing practice shortfalls, particularly delayed or missing or incomplete assessments, and the tendency of organisations to work in silos rather than collaboratively together. And you can see recommendations, particularly around wraparound support and integrated commissioning, so that commissioners are making decisions about health and social care provision alongside provisions relating to housing. And Karen, just before this this webinar, circulated the final report of the Kerslake Commission, which in fact is being launched at 3:20 this afternoon. And you will see in the final report and in their interim report recommendations which are very similar to recommendations emerging from people with lived experience and from Safeguarding Adult Reviews. Excuse me, next slide, please. And I organised, and the National Analysis organised, the evidence base around 5 domains. So direct practice with the individual, and that's where I started when I was presenting the narratives of people with lived experience, moving out to the team around the person and how the team around the person works with the individual, then looking at how different organisations support their members of the team around the person, then the governance issues, which I have begun to highlight, and then the outermost domain, the legal policy and financial context. And I've already highlighted the Everyone In initiative, which the Kerslake Commission and others believe should actually be continued, although government is not minded to do that at the moment. And you could factor in here too the shortage of social housing and the impact of financial austerity. And I, for one, along with many others, I suspect, very worried at the moment about what the impact of the withdrawal of the enhanced element of universal credit, how that will impact on lives of people close to or below the poverty margin. Next slide, please, Karen. So here is the evidence base, particularly drawn from SARs, but also informed by the voices of people with lived experience. So this slide and the next few you could use as a mental checklist, if you like, thinking about how your own organisation works with people experiencing homelessness, thinking about how the multi-agency network in your locality works with people experiencing homelessness, how many ticks against the boxes might you place, how many question marks against boxes might you place, how many crosses might you place. That kind of temperature check, if you like, will identify for you where you believe your service and the multi-agency network gets close to best practice and where there perhaps is more work to do to improve service provision for people experiencing homelessness. So 9 elements of direct practice, very much similar to the evidence base for direct practice with other forms of abuse or neglect, for example, self-neglect. the importance of being person-centered, the importance of professional curiosity, understanding a person's backstory, the person's journey to where they are today, thorough assessments, particularly of risk, mental capacity, mental health, and care and support, and so on. 9 components of best practice. Next slide, please, Karen. And then 9 components of best practice for the team around the person. Our services working together to provide integrated assessments, integrated care and support. Are we still misunderstanding GDPR and the Data Protection Act 2018? Are there still practitioners who assume that it is unlawful to share information when in fact the law does allow information to be shared when that is necessary to safeguard the welfare of an adult or a child at risk? Are we utilising, as our children's services colleagues have been doing for years, multi-agency meetings, case conferences, strategy meetings to share information, identify what the risks are, and come up with a risk mitigation plan that might include an assessment of available legal options in order to support an individual to navigate out of homelessness? And are we using Section 42 of the Care Act, the duty to inquire, and are we making appropriate referrals using the 3 criteria in Section 42 to identify the need for an inquiry, namely that an adult has care and support needs, is at risk of abuse or neglect, including self-neglect, and is unable to protect themselves from that abuse or neglect as a result of their care and support needs. There's a lot of evidence that we are not referring cases as adult safeguarding concerns, and there is some evidence too that adult social care departments are not interpreting Section 42 lawfully. Next slide, please. 6 elements of how organisations can support their colleagues who are part of the team around the person. The importance of managerial oversight of decision making, particularly in relation to complex and challenging cases. The importance of providing supervision and reflective spaces where practitioners can think through how best to intervene in a complex and challenging case. The importance of unfettered access to specialists, particularly lawyers, that might have advice to offer. The 2 Salford cases I mentioned, Eric and Kanu, both identified that access to specialist safeguarding advice and specialist legal advice happened far, far too late. In fact, in the final week of Eric's life and the final week of Kanu's life. Next slide, please. And then 6 elements of governance, particularly applied to safeguarding adult boards. The importance of auditing work to seek assurance that services are getting close to the evidence base that we have, following through the learning from safeguarding adult reviews to ensure that reviews are improving and enhancing practice, producing policies and procedures where that would provide a framework for practitioners to work within. In other words, in ensuring that there is a culture that promotes psychological safety, as one senior manager referred to it this morning, psychological safety for practitioners and operational managers. Next slide, please. In a little more detail, there are recommendations from Safeguarding Adult Reviews on governance, and this slide highlights those recommendations, and taking a leaf out of children's safeguarding and the work done by Carleen Furman and others on contextual safeguarding, recognising that there are services that one might not automatically think of who are at the front line of identifying safeguarding issues, and that includes utility companies, the Department for Work and Pensions, the Royal Mail, and no doubt others. I was involved in a case where actually security guards in the local shopping centre were an important part of contextual safeguarding. Next slide, please. Recommendations from SARs about the enhancement of practice and the management of practice. Again, reiterating, reinforcing different elements of the evidence base that I've just presented to you. For example, you can see references there to Section 42 of the Care Act and the duty to inquire. There are references here to do we have a dual diagnosis pathway, because that may well be relevant for many people experiencing homelessness. Do we have a pathway for services for women, and indeed increasingly also members of the LGBTQ plus communities, and so on? Are there pathways into services that we need to develop, and are the pathways that we've got accessible and clear? Next slide, please, Karen. And one particular review that I like, not least because it presents the voices of lived experience, but also because it took 3 strands from the government's 2018 rough sleeping strategy, the strands of prevention, intervention and recovery, and organised the evidence base around those 3 themes. And so this slide presents some of the themes that the Leeds Thematic Review identified against those 3 streams, and you can see again a synergy with the evidence base that I've run through. For example, integrated joint commissioning, something that I haven't mentioned this afternoon, but is an established part of the evidence base. How co-location of practitioners with different professional backgrounds can promote more seamless working. CPNs with police officers, for example, social workers in health centres, for example, housing staff as part of discharge teams in secondary healthcare trusts, just as examples. Next slide, please, Karen. For those of you whose work is really focused around adult safeguarding, you'll know that in the statutory guidance that accompanies the Care Act, there are 6 principles in Chapter 14 of the guidance about adult safeguarding, and those 6 principles are empowerment, prevention, protection, partnership, proportionality and accountability. And what this slide does is apply those 6 principles to work with people experiencing homelessness, again as a way of reinforcing the evidence base. Next slide, please, Karen. And I've highlighted once or twice already the outermost system within which all of our work is located, and that's the policy context, legal context and financial context set by the Westminster government. In some respects, the context that is set is distinctly unhelpful for those of us working with people experiencing homelessness, for those of us working in adult safeguarding. And the Kerslake Commission's final report highlights, for example, one aspect of that in its recommendation that the Homelessness Reduction Act should be amended to build on the duty to refer and to legislate for a duty to cooperate when seeking to reduce homelessness. There is a duty to cooperate in the Care Act. There is a duty to cooperate in the Children Act 1989. There's no duty to cooperate in the Homelessness Reduction Act or other forms of housing legislation applicable to people who are homeless or threatened with homelessness. There is still a profound misunderstanding of when it is lawful to share information, even without consent, in order to safeguard an adult at risk. The Mental Capacity Act is routinely being talked about as hard to implement, particularly when somebody appears verbally to have capacity in relation to particular decisions, but whose behaviour contradicts what they express verbally. That's the reference to executive functioning. So it is important that all of us continue to call out national government and the national systems within which we work when those systems are not helping us to safeguard individuals, and in this context, safeguarding individuals who are experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please, Karen. Covid-19, ironically, perhaps presented us with an opportunity because national government injected substantial resource into the Everybody In initiative and relaxed some of the legal rules, for example, in relation to people with no recourse to public funds, so that they could be accommodated in hotels or elsewhere during the first lockdown and the emergence of the pandemic. We know from research that the Everybody In initiative saved lives. We know from the research that the Everybody In initiative has enabled local authorities to move people on into more permanent forms of accommodation rather than to return to the streets. And we know that it enabled local authorities and their partners in health as well as in housing to construct wraparound assessments and wraparound interventions for people who came off the street, particularly with substance misuse issues, mental health issues, or physical health issues. The Everybody In initiative is not being continued, so there is a very real danger that the opportunity that the pandemic presented will be lost, and that the lessons that we have learned in relation to Everybody In will also be lost. Next slide, please. Lastly, there are just a couple of slides about how safeguarding adult boards can think about change in relation to at least the first 4 domains: direct practice, the team around the person, organisational support for the team, and governance, and to think about how they apply the evidence base in the work that the Safeguarding Adult Board does directly, for example, audits and the production of policies and procedures, and how it uses audits and similar mechanisms to seek assurance about how close services are getting to the evidence base. Next slide, please, Karen. And this is just one way of conceptualising how a Safeguarding Adult Board or a Health and Wellbeing Board or a Homelessness Reduction Board might begin to address the challenge of change. And the next slide, Karen, builds on this by identifying the different areas in which, for example, a Safeguarding Adult Board or indeed an individual service might look for change as a result of efforts to improve and enhance provision. So you might be looking for changes in attitudes, less unconscious bias, if you like. You might be looking for knowledge and skill acquisition within and across the different workforces working with people who self-neglect. You might be looking for changes in practice, and ultimately, of course, you might be looking for improvements in the well-being of service users or patients with whom you are working. Next slide, please, Karen. So we have about 9 minutes, I think, according to your schedule, to engage in a conversation. These are some questions that occurred to me, but you may well have other questions or observations to make, which is absolutely fine. And the final slide, Karen. When it moves, if it moves. The final slide is references. when you get that. Oh, we've got a dog. There are the references. Actually, the dog might be a nicer. But if you're interested in further references, you'll see the interim Kerslake report. I shall update the reference list with the final report that was published today. But that's where you can seek further information about the evidence base. That's the presentation. It's been a sprint, as I promised, but thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful, and I'm more than happy to answer questions or to listen to the observations that you have. Thanks, Karen.
That's fantastic. Thanks ever so much, Michael. We'll leave the discussion slide up because that's a really helpful framing for us to aid the conversation. Daniel, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that as a rough sleeper outreach team, probably the biggest barrier for us in terms of adult safeguarding is the transience of those who it's kind of appear to be the most vulnerable in terms of moving around the country or even outside of the UK to abroad. I'm just wondering if you had any experience of working with areas that did anything to kind of effectively tackle adult safeguarding when you lose track of somebody that you're concerned about, or on kind of a more natural level?
Yes, one of the SARs that is referenced on an earlier slide, published by Newham, but Safeguarding Adult Board, but also published by 3 other Safeguarding Adult Boards in London, the case of Mr. Y.I. or Mr. Yi, actually involved 4 local authorities and this person who was homeless crossing boundaries. And the review looks in detail at the way in which some adult social care departments sought to bounce Mr. Y.I. Into either a local authority area from which he appeared to have come, or to bounce Mr. Y.I. into a neighbouring local authority, in other words, to pass the buck. I forget which London borough it was that ultimately said enough is enough, we will assume responsibility for this person who is transient, and indeed the Safeguarding Adult Review looks at that issue. Section 19 of the Care Act is very clear. The responsible local authority in relation to a person who is transient is the local authority in whose area the person is at that time. And there is a duty on local authorities to cooperate with each other. That duty is also in the Care Act if a person is transient and moves across boundaries. The Care Act is very clear. The responsible authority is where the person is. And there would be a duty to share information when a person crosses boundaries.
Thanks, Michael. Prince has asked if there's one thing that we could focus on in terms of improving adult safeguarding with respect particularly to people experiencing homelessness. What would you say that should be?
If there was one thing, understand a person's journey. I think it really is. Every time I do a Safeguarding Adult Review, I put up the Tower Hamlets one earlier, the Ms H and Ms I review. Every Safeguarding Adult Review that I have done identifies the importance of understanding the person's journey, how they come to be the person that we see today. And we have to understand that journey because that journey may well contain clues as to why people are the people that we see today, but actually also to understand that if we simply seek to address the presenting problem, for example, their alcohol dependence, and we ignore what lies beneath the presenting problem, we are ultimately potentially doing more harm than good. So if I had to choose one it would be understand the person's journey. And that takes time.
Absolutely. Amanda.
Hi there. I was interested on any thoughts you would have on how best to work with a person whose safeguarding and care needs fluctuate. Could be on a daily basis, could be on a weekly basis, depending on where they are, because we have some difficulties managing those cases, and any advice around that client group would be really helpful.
Well, one piece of advice, Amanda, would be that adult social care, when doing care and support assessments, has a responsibility to assess future need, which means need which is foreseeable based on what is presented today and what is known about the person's history. So that would be one piece of advice. To understand, if you like, the repetitive patterns. Again, one of the things that emerges from safeguarding adult reviews time and again is the importance of understanding and addressing a repetitive pattern, and not simply seeing each presentation as a new isolated episode. See it as a pattern and address the pattern rather than an individual episode. And insofar as that pattern indicates what might be reasonably foreseeable, can you construct an intervention across agencies that seeks to address that pattern?
Very helpful, thank you.
And a question from Patrick. How would you encourage organisations to step out of any current fearful practice to engage with safeguarding referrals, not seeing it as a finger pointing exercise, but rather an opportunity to change lives and learn in the longer term?
I think it's really important, the culture that adult social care creates within adult social care, but across the multi-agency partnership. It is really important to have a culture of welcoming referrals and welcoming challenge, welcoming adult safeguarding concerns, and engaging in the appropriateness of referrals of concerns as and when they come. So a culture of continuous learning, and I think in no small measure that starts with adult social care departments, although it's a responsibility of all organisations involved in adult safeguarding. I think also a culture that there is no wrong door is really important. So that if somebody, for example, presents what you might consider an adult safeguarding concern and presents to you, not simply saying, well, it's not us, it belongs to adult social care or whatever, but doing what you can to address the needs that are presented to you, and if necessary, take the person to where they need to be rather than simply to signpost. Signposting alone is often ineffective with people experiencing homelessness. I'd say the same in relation to people who self-neglect. Not sure that that addresses the entire question, but that's my starter for 10.
Brilliant, thank you. And just going back to kind of understanding the individual's journey, do you have any particular approaches that you use that you feel are kind of more successful than others in helping people kind of share their journeys?
I think you have to use one's emotional literacy, if you like, or relationship literacy to understand how a person can engage with you. Some people will engage with you pretty quickly to help you understand what their lived experience is. Other people may be very reticent, perhaps because of past experiences of practitioners and organisations. Some people may be very reticent to open up. They may be quite defended. And in those circumstances, you need even more time. But you might actually also need to talk about everything other than the homelessness or the self-neglect or the alcohol dependence with which they present, because they're not yet ready or they don't yet feel comfortable to talk about what you really feel you and they should be talking about. So I think my advice would be, what kind of relationship in the here and now can this person manage? And if they can't manage an adult to adult conversation about homelessness, self-neglect, alcohol dependence today, then can you find a way of building up a relationship of trust with them so that at some point they will open up and tell you more about their journey. And at the risk of consuming one further minute, a practitioner once said to me that she was trying to engage an individual who was homeless and who was self-neglecting, living a street-based life, and he was adamantly refusing to talk to her about those things. He would just clam up and ask her to go away. And I said, well, what do you notice about this man? And she said, I noticed two things. He always has sandwiches from a particular supermarket, and he's always got a copy of The Guardian. So I said, talk to him about The Guardian and what's in the news, and take him a sandwich, and continually do that, and see whether through the medium of the relationship that you seek to establish with him, he will begin to open up about his journey and why he is the person that you see living a street-based life today. 6 months later, she emailed me to say that that's exactly what she had done, and he is now in temporary accommodation and receiving a care and support package from Adult Social Care. So it's just an example of one using one's relationship literacy, one's emotional literacy, and thinking about what kind of conversation can I have with this person today, and being patient.
Yeah, that's a brilliant story to end on. Thank you, Michael. In terms of taking this forward, we have the multiple exclusion, well, we called it a transition framework, but it's really kind of more than that, because we developed it during the kind of first lockdown, ready for when we were talking about sort of move on stuff, but it's much more of the kind of whole system stuff and things. Obviously with Victoria Gray, we've been having discussions about we bring in the kind of thematic stuff around safeguarding, which isn't strongly picked up through the initial bit of the framework that we developed. So we're really keen, if there are people on the call who are interested in being or keen to take this further, to have a task and finish group to develop the framework further and look at how we bring in the safeguarding aspects into that framework, and look at kind of protocols around SARs and things, particularly for our homeless people experiencing homelessness, and how we make sure we've got effective practice and effective processes in place for that, and how we use and develop the framework further for systems to ensure that, you know, a bit like Michael's put in terms of the competencies, we can factor that into the framework that we've got to ensure that people can have aspirations about how they kind of make sure they're meeting those in terms of the services and the provision that they've got in place. So if people are interested in doing that, please let Karen know, and we will make steps towards putting in place a task and finish group around that, so that we can take that forward. Thank you ever so much, Michael. That was fantastic, and really appreciate you taking the time out to come and talk to us today. We've shared your slides, and we if there are any other questions, would it be okay if we send them your way, Michael?
By all means, yes. Don't hesitate, Karen.
Thank you. Olivia, so we'll stop the recording now, and we will go on to the general update.
And I will depart.
Say goodbye. Yeah, thanks, Michael.
You're welcome. Bye for now.
Thank you, Michael.
Olivia, over to you. Is Olivia on the call? Maybe not. Okay.